Many a sleepless night have I endured pondering what were donuts like before the hole. Well, today I'm going to find out with these donuts from 1803. So thank you to Morning Brew for sponsoring this video as we make something you do not want to miss. This time on Tasting History. People disagree about a lot of things today, but one thing I feel that cannot be denied by anyone is that donuts are awesome.
I'd sell my soul for a donut.
Exactly, but instead of selling your soul, all you have to do is follow this recipe, the earliest recipe that I could find for something actually called a donut. The recipe likely comes from the mid-1700s, but it wasn't written down until 1803 in The Frugal Housewife, or Complete Woman Cook, by Susanna Carter. Dough nuts. To 1 pound of flour, put 1/4 of a pound of butter, 1/4 of a pound of sugar, and 2 spoonfuls of yeast. Mix them all together in warm milk or water of the thickness of bread. Let it raise, and make them in what form you please. Boil your fat, consisting of hog's lard, and put them in. Butter, sugar, and lard sounds delightful, especially with a nice cup of coffee, though without a hole, these might be kind of hard to dunk, even for Clark Gable.
Dunking's an art. Don't let it soak so long. A dip and flop into your mouth.
But dunked or not, the perfect way to start your morning is with a donut and your morning brew. Though, today's sponsor, Morning Brew, is not a coffee, but rather a free daily newsletter to enjoy with your coffee. See, most of the reading that I do in my daily life is about past events, like way past events, and I don't have that much time to keep up to date on what's going on in the world around me today. So now in my mornings, I've come to rely on Morning Brew to give me a quick 5-minute rundown of what's going on in the world of tech, finance, and business. You get serious stuff like how the S&P is doing, as well as cool stuff like how the new video game Elden Ring, which is huge in my house right now, had much of its world building and lore written by George R.R. Martin, because he will do absolutely anything to not finish the Game of Thrones books. Morning Brew is completely free and takes less than 15 seconds to subscribe, so if you are interested in anything finance, tech, or business, make sure to use my link in the description to subscribe to Morning Brew today. You can even read it while you're enjoying your donuts. And for this recipe, what you'll need is 3 3/4 cups or 450 grams of flour, 1 stick or 113 grams of salted butter, a half cup plus a tablespoon or 113 grams of sugar, 4½ teaspoons or 15 grams of dried yeast, a half cup or 120 milliliters of water, 3/4 of a cup or 175 milliliters of milk, and 1 quart or 1 liter of melted lard or other oil. So first, mix the tablespoon of sugar into the water and then sprinkle the yeast over it. Let it sit for about 10 minutes to bloom while you work the butter into the flour with your fingertips. Then add the sugar and work it in, and then the yeast. Then you're going to add the milk, but don't add it all at once because you might not need it all depending on what flour you end up using. You want this to be a sticky dough, but you don't want it to be unworkable. Though if you do find it too sticky, you can always just add a little bit more flour. Either way, bring it all together into a dough and then knead it until it's nice and smooth. And because this is a very sticky dough, I suggest using a stand mixer if you've got one. Once it's kneaded, put it into a bowl and cover it, letting it proof for about 1 to 2 hours or until it doubles in size. Then take it out, give it a couple more kneads, and divide it up. This should make about 2 dozen donuts. You can make them smaller, but I wouldn't make them any bigger because they will be hard to fry all the way through. Then you're going to shape the donuts, but the real question is, what shape are these donuts? Because this recipe is before the invention of the donut hole, and the recipe says to make them into whatever shape you like, so clearly there were multiple ways of doing it at the time. Now, while the word donut implies that they were probably originally round, like a nut, one recipe from 1828 calls for them to be cut in diamonds with a jagging iron or sharp knife. Diamonds, squares, and stars seem to be popular shapes for donuts in the 19th century, but I am going to go with what the Virginia Housewife recommends, and that is to shape them as cakes the size of a $50. So roll them into small balls and gently flatten them into cakes, and then place them on some parchment. Then cover them and let them proof for another 15 to 20 minutes while you heat your lard to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 175 Celsius. Then, without crowding the pot or deep fryer, add 4 or 5 donuts at a time. Now, the fry time is going to depend on a number of factors, but I'd start with 1 minute and then turn them over and fry for another minute. Then take them out and let them drain. Now, I'm using paper towels to catch all of the oil, but a 19th century German recipe says when they are cooked, place on a slice of bread to soak the fat. So if you don't have paper towels, bread might work too. Now, as we fry up the rest of the donuts, I ask you to hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to Tasting History, and allow me to take you through the wonderful world of donuts. Now, to tackle the history of donuts, we must first ask the question, what is a donut? Because if it's just any fried dough, we're gonna be here all day because every country has their own version of fried dough. Funnel cake, jalebi, beignet, zeppoli, churro. And is a churro a donut? I do not think so. So we will confine our history to the round, hole-in-the-middle donut. But even to get to that, we still gotta go way back, because the donut's ancestors include things like the ancient Roman globi, which we've made here on the channel. And in the 3rd century BC, a Chinese poem talks of fried honey cakes of rice flour and sugar malt sweet meats. Jade-like wine, honey-flavored, fills the winged cups. And when Marco Polo was in China around 1275, he mentioned these exact proto-donuts that had clearly been around for 1500 years. At the same time, in the Middle East, Scheherazad's 1001 Arabian Nights mention kun fa, swimming in bees' honey, fritters, and almond cakes. And based on recipes of the time, those fritters might have been what were called lukam al-kadi, which were balls of fermented dough fried in sesame oil, then dipped in syrup and sprinkled with sugar. Starting to sound a lot like a donut to me. And over the next few centuries, those fritters spread all over the Middle East, Northern Africa, and up into Europe. Similar fritters made with apples became all the rage during Lent, and in the 14th century Spanish cookbook, Libre de Sansovy, there's a recipe for buñols, which at the time were egg and cheese donuts that were fried and covered in sugar. At the same time, the Germans were making a whole host of Schmalzgebackens, including one with the unfortunate name Krapfen, which is actually the ancestor of today's jelly donut. Now, one of the most important recipes in the history of donuts comes from Bartolomeo Scappi and is for an enriched leavened dough with cinnamon and raisins that was fried, then covered in sugar. And it's important because it led to a Dutch recipe for oliekoeken, or oily cakes. Today they're often called oliebollen, or oily balls. These first appeared in the 1667 cookbook De Verstandige Kok. And these Dutch oliekoeks ended up becoming American donuts because, as They Might Be Giants told us, even old New York was once New Amsterdam, and it was in New York that donuts became a thing. Washington Irving wrote about this culinary handoff in his satirical History of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty in 1809. Sometimes the table was graced with immense apple pies or saucers full of preserved peaches and pears, but it was always sure to boast an enormous dish of balls of sweetened dough fried in hog's fat and called doughnuts, or oliekoeks. A delicious kind of cake at present scarce known in the city excepting in genuine Dutch families. Though Irving's history was a satire, he even wrote it under the pseudonym Diedrich Knickerbocker. So anything it says does need to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but his link between the two pastries does seem plausible. Though his claim that they were scarcely known except in Dutch families seems probably not true, because oliekoeks, and by that time donuts, were popular throughout New York. Also, giving full credit to the Dutch for making the American donut seems a bit too generous, as other fried doughs like the French beignet or even the German Krapfen likely also contributed to our modern-day donut, and the name donut is most definitely of English origin, though this connection between donuts and the Dutch does seem to persist. I think it was in 1796 that Mrs. Yeroman set a table in the market to sell hot coffee for 3 pence a cup and doughnuts for 1 penny each. She was a large woman and reported to weigh 225 pounds, a genuine vrouw from the heights of Bergen. As she moved in the market with her broad Dutch face, the butcher boys sung out, "There goes the large donut." Kids can be so cruel. But by 1819, the donut had broken away from its European brethren and found its own place in the fried dough family. In the legend of Sleepy Hollow, Washington Irving describes cakes of various and almost indescribable kinds, known only to experienced Dutch housewives. There was the doughty donut, the tenderer oliekoek, and the crisp and crumbling kruller. So the donut had now become distinct, but its evolution was far from over. First, when did it make the leap from the dessert table to the breakfast table? We're not exactly sure, but Henry David Thoreau wrote that in Cape Cod, at breakfast we had eels, buttermilk cake, cold bread, green beans, donuts, and tea. I, for one, am very glad that eels have fallen off the breakfast menu. Now, the other, even more iconic step was, when did the donut get its hole? See, many donuts at the time had a reputation for either being burnt to a crisp on the outside or underdone on the inside. And both the Dutch and the English had a way to get around this problem, and that was to make it so that the middle was not dough at all. Now, I fancy you wondering what a donut can be. Well then, picture to yourself a round ball of dough, quite brown outside. Now open it. Oh, there is a little cluster of plums in the middle. Plums being another word for raisins or other dried fruit, but American recipes from the time never had this for their donuts, and so American donuts were either burnt to a crisp or raw inside. That is, until Captain Hanson Gregory came along. Now this is almost undoubtedly a myth, but it is a good myth and the most persistent myth. The story goes that in 1847, Captain Gregory of Maine went out a-sailing along with some nutmeg and cinnamon donuts that his mother Elizabeth had made for him. The problem was her donuts were always raw in the center, and so he took the top of a tin pepper box and cut out that uncooked dough in the middle, making the first donut hole ever seen by mortal eyes. Though another version of his story has him jamming the donut onto one of the spokes of the ship's wheel during a storm because he needed both hands but still wanted to eat the donut. Doesn't seem likely. Also, I recently found this painting of a little girl from 50 years before this whole story, and it appears that she is holding a donut with a hole, so it really makes me question everything. But that ended up becoming the standard form of most donuts. And doing that allows the oil to get up into the center of the donut, cooking it evenly all the way through. Now I know what you're thinking. You haven't even been listening to me ever since you realized donuts don't seem a very practical food for a long sea voyage, but they were surprisingly popular on whaling ships. To celebrate the filling of the 1,000th barrel of whale oil, it was customary to fry up a batch of donuts in that oil. In a diary entry from 1846, it said, "At 7 p.m. boats got fast to a whale. At 9 got him to the ship. Men all singing and bawling donuts. Donuts tomorrow, as this will certainly make us 1,000 barrels." Now fortunately, whale oil did not remain the most popular oil for frying donuts, because shortening was a lot cheaper and a lot easier to get your hands on. There was Crisco, and then another company called Cream Crisp, which boasted it will cut your lard and butter bills squarely in two. Now Cream Crisp was only around for a short while before Procter & Gamble, who owned Crisco, slapped them with a patent lawsuit, and Cream Crisp ended up going away. And they were definitely gone by 1937 when Krispy Kreme opened its doors. And the company says that this is not the case, but I kind of wonder if there isn't some link, because how much of a coincidence is it to spell crisp and cream having to do with donuts with K's? It just seems too much. Regardless, before Krispy Kreme was serving up donuts, it was a job for the Salvation Army. During World War I, Ensign Margaret Sheldon and Adjutant Helen Purviance, in an effort to cheer up homesick troops on the front lines, began frying donuts. Originally supposedly in the metal helmets of soldiers, and only later upgrading to empty trash cans. They would hand them out to the boys and became known as donut lassies or donut dollies. And it's fitting that they were handing these out to dough boys, which was often what the American soldiers were called, though the term has actually nothing to do with donuts. Now while World War I eventually came to an end, the soldiers' love for donuts did not. They returned home and they demanded donuts, and the home cooks of America just could not keep up with demand. But in 1920, a Russian immigrant named Adolf Levitt invented, and this is the real name, the wonderful, almost human automatic donut machine. And it pumped out 1,000 donuts an hour in his New York bakery. Now, he was not the first person to spell donut D-O-N-U-T, but he was the first person to make it very popular, it seems. Possibly because it took up less ink, or possibly because the Yiddish word was donat, D-O-N-A-T, or it just made it easier to sound out to his largely immigrant customer base. Now he eventually started selling the machine under a shorter name, the Display Donut Machine, and by 1931 he was making $25 million a year selling these donut machines all around the world. The New Yorker described one of these donut machines in Times Square. "We can tell you a little about the donut-making place in Broadway. Donuts float dreamily through a grease canal in a glass-enclosed machine, walk dreamily up a moving ramp, and tumble dreamily into an outgoing basket." Other than the fact that the writer couldn't come up with a synonym for dreamily, it does sound quite nice. The donut craze continued, especially after being named Hit Food of the Century of Progress at the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. And they really were the hit food of the century, because it wasn't long before donut shops began springing up all over the country. There was Spud Nuts and Krispy Kreme, both of whom used potato in their donuts. And then there was Randy's, Winchell's, and Dunkin' Donuts. And while they became popular elsewhere, like at Tim Hortons in Canada, donuts remain a quintessentially American food. After all, who is more quintessentially American than that greatest of donut lovers, Homer J. Simpson? And I have to wonder, what would Homer think of our 2 centuries old donuts? And here we are, donuts from 1803. Now, a lot of recipes from the time say to dust them in nutmeg or cinnamon or sugar. I went with a little bit of powdered sugar, but you can put a lot of different things on them to kind of flavor them. But let's give them a shot. That's really good. So they're not as sweet as a modern donut, like if you got a cake donut or something like that. Not quite as sweet, but still has a little sweetness to it. They kind of remind me, flavor-wise, of a sweet croissant. Texture-wise, it reminds me a lot of a modern donut. Maybe a little denser, but not that much. The center, it actually looks pretty well done to me, maybe a little bit underdone. But that's why I made some that were round with a hole in it to see if there is a big difference. Yep, completely cooked all the way through. I'm not gonna lie, donuts are kind of a pain in the butt to make, but they are really, really good, and you know, if you have the time and inclination, I definitely suggest you do it. Now, I did want to share with you one of Adolf Levitt, the guy who made the donut machine, one of his mottos. It was called the Optimist's Creed. As you ramble on through life, brother, whatever be your goal, keep your eye upon the donut and not upon the hole. Definitely words to live by. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I will see you next time on Tasting History, several pounds more, because you know I'm going to be finishing all these donuts.